Welcome to lesson 2. Here we're going to look at client onboarding and periodization. So here is a chronology of what I call the client communication flow and the onboarding process. So I have to give a lot of credit to my friend and colleague Danielle Blasco for a lot of the bones of this process, which she essentially perfected. So week 1 is where the coach sends the intake form to the client through an onboarding email. And you can formulate your own welcome email. And basically, you'll be asking the client to track all food and drink for 6 days. So you will be able to really kind of dig into what's going on with their habits and take it from there. So week 2, the coach assesses the client intake form and food logs and creates a big picture plan. So in other words, a periodized or phasic plan, and this has to be individualized, of course. And also on week 2, the coach sends the client their specific dietary program, including physical activity programming if applicable, and also habits to work on. Week 3, this is where we begin the coaching check-in calls with the client. And you can either have the client use a macro tracking sheet or assign the client to use a food tracking database or app that you like, and one that you can also be in on to be able to see their food logs remotely. Week 4, assess how the client is doing with adherence and also what limitations they have. And this is also prime time to problem solve and troubleshoot since you've had a number of weeks under your belt. And it's usually at the 4-week block that you can just buckle down and begin to assess what's going on progress-wise. Okay, so week 5 would begin the next block that you would take the client through. So you want to start that off with identifying any habits or barriers hindering the process. And if needed, assign pre-planned behavioral targets. So one of the effective tactics, and this is actually published in the literature, is if-then implementations. So if-then implementations are built around scenarios or situations that are individualized to your client. For example, if you're at an office meeting or if you're at a cocktail party and you're presented with some sort of element that may sabotage your goals temporarily, or if you're at a birthday party or a family gathering and you're presented with, for example, drinks or desserts or various saboteurs, then you can have an if-then action plan for a list of the most common saboteurs that the client may experience. And this is going to be different with everybody. Not everybody is going to be in an office situation. Not everybody is going to be in a dorm type of situation. So you have to individualize your if-then likely scenarios, okay, for clients. They're going to be different per client. And these things can be really sort of useful in the sense that you're not necessarily prescribing specific foods or macros. You're really getting into the process of habit building. Habit building is just a repetitious set of actions that are paired with specific scenarios that the client may encounter. And these scenarios are not always going to be identical, but they're going to be similar in nature, and then you can create the if-then implementations based on those. And it's a great way to help your client build habits. Okay, so let's take a look at some basic principles of periodization. Periodization is just jargon for the structuring of planned changes in program variables. So what is periodization? Phases, planned change. That's what it is. So periodizing in exercise programming, which you may be familiar with typically involves blocks or phases focusing on different skills or energy systems. And they culminate in a peaking phase with competitive athletic sports. So the work involved with these phases depends on the overarching goal. As you can see, I wrote goal twice. I guess that may be Freudian. Maybe I'm very goal oriented. I.e., endurance versus hypertrophy versus strength power versus a specific skill. So the phase depends on the overarching goal. And a typical example in athletic sports is the off-season phase, preseason phase, and the in-season phase. Now, periodization in the nutritional coaching context is predominantly going to focus on body composition related goals. And the majority of those body composition related goals are going to be weight loss or fat loss. And a minority of those goals are going to fall within athletic performance. So let's look at the most common form of periodization that you will encounter. And that is a body composition oriented scenario. All right, so this slide is very busy and very, very wordy. So you may want to just either screenshot it and put it in your back pocket, or just refer back to it as a reference point. But note that we've got 3 phases here. So a building/recovery phase that lasts 4 to 12 weeks, priming/transition phase that lasts 2 to 6 weeks, and then an active dieting phase lasting 12 to 24 weeks. And so when you present your client with the big picture, for example, you can leave a much more profound impression on somebody that you just start working with if you say, hey, we can map out the next year of your life and have a plan of attack to get to where we need to go, and take productive steps and clearly defined steps towards that goal. And so that's a lot more comforting from the client's perspective. And from your perspective, it helps you stay organized and focused on the many moving parts. And so the objectives of the building and recovery phase, okay, build out and visually present a long-term plan, 6 to 12 months, if applicable. And you have these various elements within the specific phase. So this first phase, as you can imagine, it's mainly teaching the client the necessary baseline skills, like establishing macronutrient targets, establishing food selection habits. And also in this building and recovery phase, this can be at a point where you may find that some clients initially start off with you after months or years of just chronic, cyclical, and sometimes constant dieting and restriction. So they're physically fatigued, psychologically fatigued from the dieting process. And sometimes what these people need are just to actually eat more. So the whole increasing energy flux paradigm, where people consume more so they can move more and move better and be in a better mood, that would apply here. And in more recent years, the process has been called reverse dieting. And the reverse dieting process has been over technicalized, if you will. And it's been made to be too gradual, to the point where people who need to recover from prolonged cyclical or consistent deficit need to do so better, more quickly than gradually. So it's okay for things to be gradual, but when the increments are too small in a, in quotes, reverse diet, then you're just kind of prolonging the recovery process. So I would recommend roughly 10% increases in calories per week if you can. 10 to 20 even percent in calories until you establish a certain baseline and a certain set of parameters that would indicate, okay, this person is feeling good, they're performing good, they are finally not feeling physically and psychologically deprived. So that is a whole world unto itself. But other elements within the building and recovery phase: improve daily adherence and structure, establish the hedonic allotment and strategy. In other words, establish the, in quotes, junk meal or junk allotment. This can be done by just allocating 10 to 20% of whatever the person wants, 10 to 20% of total calories from whatever the person wants. And then, of course, you have your 80 to 90% of the diet being wholesome, whole foods and minimally refined foods of sound to Spartan food selection. So, and of course, track biofeedback and address any issues. And then you can move on to the priming or the transition phase, which is a little bit shorter, about half the length of the building/recovery phase. And you're basically priming them to get into the active phase of what you ultimately want to help them accomplish. So in the priming phase, you establish that, okay, we've attained the type of maintenance level that we want to be at before we start the active phase. If it's a performance-oriented goal, you'd be looking at performance preparedness. Of course, you'd be tracking biofeedback, some of the critical ones being sleep, stress and mood, energy, and digestion. These will tell you important things. And what you also want to do in the priming and transition phase is to narrow down the dietary tracking approach for the next phase. Not everybody will want to take a highly granular and precise and quantitative approach to tracking. Not everybody will want to or be able to or have a natural proclivity towards tracking very small units like grams of the macronutrients. A lot of people will. And I would venture to say that the majority will be okay with it since it's such kind of a normal thing. But you have to be wary of who is just not ready for that degree of micromanagement. And then there are other approaches that you can take that are a bit more habit-based, a little bit more qualitative. So establish the tracking approach during the priming and transition phase. And this is ideally after they've had this boot camp phase where they have actually learned what the nutritional values are of the foods that they eat and the portion sizes that they eat are. Okay, so now we're on to the active dieting phase where you initiate the caloric deficit and maintain 10 to 20 calories, 10 to 20% of calories from discretionary foods or discretionary calories. And that would be your indulgent foods like desserts and drinks and stuff. And track body composition changes with multiple assessment tools to minimize blind spots. That's important. I think that you can't rely on a single tool to tell you accurately and reliably enough what's going on with body composition. So at minimum, you'd be using some kind of device, whether it's simple or whether it's sophisticated, and you'd be using that along with pictures and or vids. And pictures are a little bit more feasible in terms of memory space and the exchange of information remotely. But you don't want to rely on a single method for tracking body composition. In private practice, I actually ran bioelectrical impedance as well as skin fold calipers at the same time, and I of course had a weighing scale too. In retrospect, it would have been cool to have a multi-frequency BIA, like an in-body. that I could cross-check the skin fold measurements with. And so, yeah, if you can get a second opinion as far as assessment goes, then that's ideal. But sometimes that's not feasible, and sometimes you're only relegated to pictures as well as a single device. And in any case, whether you have multiple assessment tools or just very little assessment tools, you should get it across to your client that, hey, we're taking an educated guess here. This is a snapshot in time. There is a margin of error with these devices. They just give you an educated guess. And we're looking at the trend line over time more than we are just basically putting all our eggs in a single basket with each assessment. Okay. And another bullet point I want to point out over here is after tracking biofeedback, sleep, stress, mood, energy, digestion, auto-regulate a 7-day diet break based on psychological/physical fatigue from dieting. What my kind of go-to model for diet breaks is people tend to get psychologically fatigued from dieting every 4 to 8-ish weeks. So you can auto-regulate a 7-day diet break. And we went into the specifics of diet breaks and maintenance phases and nonlinear carbohydrate intakes and stuff. You go over to the module on progress plateaus to look at the details of things like diet breaks and maintenance phases. But just briefly, in the active dieting phase, you may want to consider implementing a 7-day diet break for every 5 to 10 pounds that the client loses. Because it's usually at those 5 to 10 pound intervals that they're kind of ready to ease off the gas pedal of dieting for a temporary period before getting back into the grind. And then also consider a maintenance phase once the client has reached 50% of the goal. So a maintenance phase is what I call maintenance practice, since plateaus are good practice for maintenance. And so, yes, once again, go back to the metabolic adaptation and progress plateaus module in order to get more detail on things like maintenance phases and diet breaks. But that's where they would happen in the active/dieting phase. And this is, I wanted to put some extra notes about this model, this periodized model, this phasic model here, where we've got a building phase, a priming phase, and an active dieting phase. Okay, so although it may be ideal to have a full-blown, 4 to 12-week building and recovery phase, some clients might have tougher time constraints that negate the possibility of starting off with a building/recovery phase. And if that is the case, then the coach must essentially cram the tasks that you originally had planned for the building phase. You have to basically cram it into the priming phase. Once again, not everybody's going to get in front of you as an initial or a prospective client and say, hey, we have a whole year to work with. How are we going to lay this out? Some people will come up to you and say, hey, I have 3 months to get something done. Or some people say, hey, I got 6 weeks to look a certain way. Can you work with this? So some client scenarios, speaking of which, some client scenarios have even more urgent time constraints that necessitate the incorporation of the vital client tasks and skills into this final phase right here, into the active dieting phase. So you just have to get started on these things ASAP. Of course, minus the caloric increase part, minus the increase energy flux or reverse dieting part. That's precluded from scenarios where somebody has a very tight time constraint in order to lose a certain amount of body fat. So yes, the timeframes presented here are typical, but are not set in stone. So coaches should use this model as a flexible and individualizable template. So my hope is to be able to present you with realistic timeframes over here and common timeframes that clients typically have at their disposal, except for a minority of cases who are, okay, it's ASAP time. I have a family reunion in 8 weeks, type of thing. And like I said, nothing's set in stone. You can individualize the timeframes and tweak the various tasks and objectives to fit the specific client. And that's the name of the game. You have a framework from which to individualize plans. And that concludes lesson 2. I'll see you back on lesson 3, where we talk about important questions that are typically missing from the client screening questionnaire or initial interview.